Welcome once again to the study of the Long Scroll with David Chaim Smith and Sophia. And this episode is unique and important because today we are going to cover the 9 chambers that are attributed to the pinnacle of realization and to Gnosis itself. And we're going to actually discuss each of the chambers with quite a bit of lead up from last time where we didn't even get to them. So today we're going to exclusively just concentrate on the 9 chambers and talk about them as much as we possibly can. But before that point, I want to just recapitulate what brings us to this pinnacle of accomplishment and do it with brevity and hopefully with clarity as well. We start with a Malkut, an appearance field, a display of reality. Unlike an emanationist system that sees a Malkut as the byproduct of a process, we see it as the magic itself, the ground in display. In other words, from the view that I hold, there is no difference between Malkut and Ein Sof. No difference whatsoever. No diminishment, no reduction, no limitation. However, saying that and realizing it are 2 totally different things. So what happens when one finds oneself in the display field and it is ordinary? Well, at that point, if one is dissatisfied with the ordinariness, one raises the fire of life force through the triad of Nehi, which is Netzach, Hod, and Yasod, which is attributed to ordinary consciousness, from the triad of Nehi into the triad of Chagat, which is Chesed, Gvur, Tiferet, which is a finer, more subtle capacity of the mind that not everybody gets. It's certainly not ordinary, but it's not uncommon. What is uncommon is raising life force from the triad of Chagat into the triad of Chabad, Chokmah, Bina, and Dat. And there, at the point of Dat, the sum total of the mind's vocabulary, the sum total of experience, the sum total of being from the perspective of the mind gathers and accumulates in order to be surrendered through the auspices of Chokmah and Bina over to Keter for mystical realization to find its root. Now, keep in mind that when this gathering at Dat occurs, the Ruach puts everything there. The Dat is the summary, literally, of your everything. The entire world, the entire contents of your capacity to perceive it, and all the possibilities that go into the making of reality to you. Now, we know as human beings that we can't possibly know and be and experience everything. We only experience and know our version of everything. That's our dot. Make sense so far, Sophia?
So your dot is, in a nutshell, just accumulated human experience and perception. Is that right?
That's right. It's what you got. It's what you got to make the final surrender to the infinite. What is it that your offering consists of as a human being? Everything. What is everything to a human being? Well, that's really the question. It's limited. It's a limited scope of perception, right? Whatever you have to surrender, that's what you have. That's your dot. And ultimately, the point of surrender is between Dat and Keter. And the only thing that stands between them is the oscillation of Chokmah and Bina. The term that I use to describe Bina is dark luminosity. The term that I use to describe Chokmah is luminous darkness. They're essentially the same thing. It's essentially the basic spiritual essence of reality itself, beyond a subjective perceiver and a so-called objective universe that is perceived. How do you realize Gnosis? Well, you realize Gnosis by the giving forth of all of your limitations into limitlessness. All of the things that change, you give away to changelessness, right? And this happens through the dark brilliance of the light that is called Or En Sof, right? Which is the light of your own mind in its essence.
So why is it that we're making a surrender to begin with? Why is that a function of realizing Gnosis?
Because the operating system that we're working under is insufficient. The operating system that creates an individual human being, that separates a subject that knows from objects in object fields, in object realms that become known, that dualism places restrictions and reductions and limitations on the light as it functions as mind. If we are sufficiently dissatisfied with this limited scenario and limited scope of being, it gnaws away at us. And a practitioner is simply somebody who has been so dissatisfied that they seek to take the ultimate step to get out of the situation that they find themselves in. If you're okay with ordinary mental functioning, you don't have to surrender anything. You just live your life, you chase happiness, you try to get away from unhappiness and pain, you usually reproduce biologically, and you seek to maximize your experience, blah, 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 then you're dead. Okay, fine. Many people are okay with this. Practitioners feel as though there must be something more. And for such a rare weirdo, we offer everything that we have in the service of the discovery and realization of what that something more can be. That's called Gnosis. I hope that answers your question.
I suppose so. From what I've understood about our previous talks, it has something to do with the surrender part is what you just described, and it also has something to do with sort of using your life force as a fuel toward realizing the Gnosis. Like, it's not like it just happens. It needs some sort of kindling to help it along because it's such an arduous process.
Oh, yeah. All of that we've covered in quite a bit of detail. And that life force rises, drawn from the display field of Malkut, through the triad of Nahi, through the triad of Chagat, up to that dot point. And it is the sum total of life force that is offered. But to us, we perceive that life force. So it becomes our perception. It becomes our perception of everything. So in this sense, when I talk about life force, I'm including both the act of perceiving and that which is perceived. They're the same light. They're the same luminosity. They're the same divine expression. But from the point of view of the individual body-mind, they're limited in scope. So when Dot surrenders this tremendous life force that is in the process of perceiving to Keter, Keter goes through these three phases of receiving the sacrifice. The first we called the infinite head, remember from last week. The second we call the head of nothingness, the head of Ayin. And the third I call the headless head. The Zohar calls it the head which is not. So these three phases, without rehashing too much of what we said last time, they go through phases of opening and receiving the total surrender of Dot. The first establishes wholeness, a unicity. The second realizes what I call the black ether, the point at which something and nothing lose their division. The point at which reification becomes impossible and drops away. The surrender is finally accepted by God, you could say, when reification goes away. So if you take out the mythology, what are we actually surrendering? We're actually surrendering our reification, the habit of reification. And that's what Keter receives. And what is realized is the headless head, the open luminosity. And it's in that open luminosity that the 9 chambers are realized. The 9 chambers are a picture of the lower 9 sphirot as they are realized as not separate in any way from the ground of the Or Ein Sof. When there ceases to be a dividing line at Keter between Ein Sof and the rest of the sphirot, reification is present. When no reification is present, Keter is, as we've said many times, an open door. So what is realized in Keter is the ground of Or Ein Sof itself. And from that understanding, all the functions of the sphirot are understood anew. So we have 9 chambers because it is 9 sphirot that have been surrendered to Keter. Malkut, Yesod, Hod, Netzach, Tferet, Gevura, Chesed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And Chokhmah and Bina create the means by which the lower 7 are carried to the crown. The 9 chambers that are realized in Keter are 3 rows of 3. And these 3 rows, top, middle, and bottom, can be looked at from afar before we get into the actual individual chambers. We could say that the top row, which is usually read from left to right, is a picture of the state of the ground prior to reflection in the world of contrasts. Meaning, the top row is a picture of the Or Ein Sof in its essence, its nature, and its capacity for display. However, it's the 3 qualities, which is really summing up everything that we could say about the ground, before it enters into appearance, display, and the associations of the body-mind that are imputed upon it. The body-mind's habits take the display and reduce it to a series of things. What is the ground when no thing is reified? What is the ground in and of itself prior to the mind's constant habit of trying to reduce it into little mental packages? Well, there will be an essence, the ground's essence. There will be the nature of that essence, and the nature is actional. It's what the essence does. And there will be the capacity to give of itself for some form of display. So this is why I use the term prior to reflection. But let's go over this word prior a little bit before we get to the individual chambers. I'm not using it in a temporal sense, as if we're saying this is Ein Sof prior to God saying, let there be light. It's not prior in time. It's not prior in a linear line of events. When I talk about prior in this sense, what I'm talking about is a more foundational state. It's as if we're talking about the ocean. And the surface of the ocean has waves that rise up and crest and then fall down and join the ocean again. And over and over and over, turbulent individual circumstances seem to create details within the surface of the ocean, right? So you could talk about the beginning and end of individual waves and their cresting and their falling and so on and so forth. But if you really want to understand the ocean, you have to start with water. What is the water that makes the waves, right? So you could say that an understanding of water is prior or more foundational to the discussion of the activity of the water in making individual waveforms. So when we're talking about prior, we're talking about it in this more foundational or more abstract sense, because the waves are a subset of the water. There's no other way to look at it. From this point of view, we could say that appearance and all the functions of the Sphirot are a subset of the ground, are a subset of Or Ein Sof. So from the perspective of Or Ein Sof, the consideration of the ground as such, the consideration of the ground itself, comes before or is prior or needs to be understood before any consideration of its subset functions are brought into play. So just like the waves are a subset of the water of the ocean, the ground is prior to the subset of what the ground expresses of itself. So hopefully you'll understand that prior has this much more foundational implication than the way it's usually used in terms of a timeline. And of course, you know, we have the religious accounts of Genesis, where the world is seen, at least in most monist systems, the world is seen as a subset of God. So God is seen as prior to the world because from a religious point of view, God created the world out of itself. You take away the timeline, and from this non-emanationist perspective, we could say that nothing was created here. The ground is always the ground, but the ground expresses itself. And it's the nature of what makes that expression creative that we're interested in, prior to reflection. You with me so far?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. So how is it that the ground reflects itself in particular ways? Where does the particularity of expression come from?
Well, that's a very good question. In order to answer that question, we have to understand why it's creative to begin with. Then we can understand the mechanism of creativity and how it functions. Basically, you're asking where creativity comes from. It comes from the ground's nature. So let's start at the upper left hand corner of the 9 chambers and talk about the basic essence of the ground. The basic essence is openness, or what we could call no-thingness. Openness is just simply open. However, it's not open in a dualistic sense, as opposed to being closed. It's open in the sense that it asserts total possibility, the total fullness of possibility, with no reduction to any set of individual possibilities or relationships. The openness is an open fullness that is sometimes called a plenum of possibility, absolute possibility, if you want to say it like that. So openness is the capacity for anything, everything, and nothing equally. A total, absolute, possibilizing expanse that doesn't reduce itself to any mental construct or quality or anything that you could say about it whatsoever. So very often it is just referred to as a nothingness. And the word nothingness is problematic because it's interpreted in a dualistic way by the human mind, nothing as opposed to something. So I prefer the term openness, but we know that that openness is full in the absolute sense, full of possibility. So this possibilizing openness, which cannot be comprehended, because if you try to comprehend it, in other words, if you try to reduce it to a thought, you'll only have an approximation. You'll never understand what the real thing implies. So we could think about a nothingness fullness all we want. We'll never get there. It can only be realized in contemplation. It is literally non-conceptual. So that's its essence. What's its nature? Well, we covered this in the very first card of the 32 keys and in the very first session of the long scroll, that the nature of this openness fullness is divulgent, luminous. It gives of itself by continually seeking to thrust its possibilizing fullness into some form of expression. It can't repress its divulgent nature. Its luminosity makes the openness bright. And here, when I use the term bright, remember what Chokhmah and Bina imply. We're talking about a brightness or a brilliance that is inseparable from absolute darkness. It's not a dualistic binary brightness. It's brightness in the sense of its dynamism. It's dynamically bright because when it's brought to its absolute peak of intensity, it's what we call knowingness or awareness, which cannot be limited to any mind. Essentially, the dark knowing brightness of the Or Ein Sof is our own awareness. But once it becomes an individual human mind, it can't realize itself. It's like the knife that can't cut itself. So it's reduced to thoughts and feelings and subject-object interactions, and its true nature, literally its true nature, is unknown to it. So we have an essence that is open, and the nature of that essence, which is divulgent or luminous or bright or brilliant in the dark sense, meaning in the absolutely transcendent sense. So we have an open fullness of pure possibility, and then we have the surge of that possibilizing dynamic, which is simply what we call the light, the Or of Ein Sof, the Or Ein Sof. So right here, the openness and the divulgent brightness, this is the Or Ein Sof, the essence and its nature. Sometimes they're combined, and we just refer to these two aspects as the essential nature of reality. If you understand that, just those two aspects right there are the foundation of the entire system. Massively important. So before I even go on, ask me anything you want about the essence and the nature, the openness and its divulgent surge.
So I guess my first thought would be, why is it that the openness is divulgent? And I know in the past you've said that that's just its nature, but I almost feel like that's not enough of an explanation for me. It's like, I really want to know why that is its nature. I mean, is this just something that's totally unknowable?
What you're asking about is the biggest mystery of the whole ball of wax here, because if we start out by saying we're looking around and we're noticing that reality can be noticed, what's the first thing that the human mind determines about reality? A series of finite things, right? Individual forms, moments in time, locations in space, thoughts and feelings that seem limited. So it seems from the outset that we live in a limited, fragmented reality, a finite reality, or a reality that's comprised of finite things and states. Then we learn when we investigate that the true nature of reality is not like that at all. The true nature of reality is actually infinite. So what you're asking is essentially, why does the infinite conceal itself in what appears to be finite? Because the question that you're asking about creativity makes the finite display. So when you're asking why, you're not just asking why does the openness express brilliant divulgence? Well, the answer is to display or express reality in an infinite variable way. Well, why would it want to do that? Why would the infinite want to display infinite variation? You're really asking why the infinite would want to be entering into this dialogue between that which is known and that which knows. The interesting thing about that question is kind of stated in reverse. If it didn't do that, what would be the implication? If it didn't do that, if the essence didn't express its nature, there would only be nothingness. There would be neither a discussion about reality, a process to investigate it, or the awareness with which to investigate it. There would be absolute nothingness. So, if we can say that absolute nothingness expresses its nature in order to be engaged, it's something about that engagement, that concealment of the infinite within the finite, that answers the question of why. It's not a rational why, but we know that all possibilities become possible one by one through a field of infinite variation because of this tendency, this creative tendency, this creative nature. The why is just simply the expressiveness itself, to engage itself and ultimately realize itself. That's the why. There is no other reason. There is no rational reason that the Ein Sof would present a series of puzzles that only end up in either the realization of its nature or the non-realization of its nature. There are some who have speculated from the standpoint of philosophy that this is kind of like a cruel joke, setting up a seemingly finite universe that conceals the infinite nature, which is unknowable. Well, the mystic becomes intensely interested in this joke and wants to laugh along with it. An ordinary person just takes it at face value and would say, well, I don't care. So if you're asking why, you're already on one side of that divide. So
yeah.
So you with me so far?
Yeah,
on
let's
the
laugh along with it.
Well,
I think so.
I'll put it to you this way. If you ask that question, is it like you even have a choice?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the curiosity is going to remain regardless of whether or not the question even gets answered.
Right.
So it is sort of a cruel joke in some ways, but yeah, you're forced to laugh at some point. So I noticed that down here, you've got the top 3 chambers differentiated from the lower 6. And I think you just went over that in your explication of the essence of the ground. But my understanding was that the 9 chambers were all equal to each other. So I'm wondering if maybe you covered it already, or maybe you've got more to say about why you're differentiating the top 3 from the lower 6.
Excellent question. In order to answer that question, I have to finish with the third of the top row because I only did the first 2. And the third, all the way on the right of the top row, is the resonance. If we have an openness that is divulgent by nature, self-luminous by nature, expressive by nature, which hopefully you understand from a non-emanationist perspective. It doesn't stop being open simply because it divulges its luminosity. The luminosity is itself open, right? The essence and the nature. Well, what happens is that essential nature, as a continuum, displays itself. And the way that it displays itself is through this quality of resonance. Resonance is like the idea that the power to express itself builds to an absolute level. And when I say builds, I don't mean that it starts from point 1 and builds up to point 10. There is no increase or decrease. It is an infinite sense of fullness resonating within itself, beyond any linear understanding of process. So what this produces, what the resonance produces, is what I call a superabundance. In other words, the openness presents its divulgent nature to such a peak of intensity that its capacity to display itself is absolutely overwhelming. And as a result of this, it just pours itself out beyond all boundaries, beyond all limitations. In an undifferentiated sense, the superabundance of the ground has no sense of containment or reduction whatsoever. It is an infinitely resonant field. And if you understand that that infinite resonant field is prior to individual reflections of things. Remember, we're talking about the water that forms the waves. We're talking about the undifferentiated sense of the ground. Number 1, it's open. Number 2, it's divulgent. Number 3, it is absolutely full, and that fullness resonates within itself so profoundly that as it is expressed, it just simply spills over into whatever variation arises as a result of its expression. So this superabundant resonance is the actual function of the display. Sometimes the term energy is used, that we have an essence, which is open, a nature that is divulgent, and a display which performs in an energetic manner, meaning as constant change, as a constant projection of the ground in its fullness. So when we seek to know the glimpse within the nature of phenomena of this superabundance, it could only be described as a resonance with no beginning and no end, that has no start, no culmination, an infinite absolute resonance of superpositioned possibilities. And that is prior to whatever arises. So that means that whatever arises is a subset of that resonance. So that resonance would be inherent in whatever arises. So if we perceive a so-called limited thing, let's say I perceive this glass of water, which is a so-called limited thing. This glass of water is a subset of an infinite resonant ground that provides all possibilities through all vectors of expression simultaneously. So in its essential nature, the display of this glass is nothing other than the essential nature. It hasn't departed from it. It can't reduce it. It's a subset of it. Just like we could say that the crest of the wave is a subset of the water of the ocean. When we want to understand the deep value of things, the deep meaning of things, we go past what they appear to be, and we seek what they are foundationally, prior to the acts of reflection as individual things. That's the top row. You with me so far?
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying that the bottom row speaks a little bit more to individuation of things, more so than the top row does, even though they're all sort of still at this a priori place.
The whole 9 chambers is addressing the issue of the ground. However, as you just said, there's a difference between addressing the ground prior to reflection in an undifferentiated sense and addressing the ground from the standpoint of what appears. So just like you said, yes, the top row are free of the considerations of whatever arises, whatever appears, the individual seemingly finite phenomena. But the bottom two rows deal directly with appearance. Now that we understand the ground of which the appearances are subsets, we could talk about what happens when appearance seems to arise. Well, what happens is that nothing separates from that ground. It's the ground all the time. The ground can always be understood no matter what arises in its nature and its essence, and ultimately through its display. The middle row of the 9 chambers addresses appearance prior to its outset. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. When we go back to the original Tzimtzum circle, when we go back to the original paradox of creativity and the residue of, remember what we said, in order to make the Tzimtzum circle, what is described is the Or Ein Sof contracted from a central point out to the sides and was removed from the circle, from the center out to the sides, making a vacated space, a halal apanui, a vacated space. But that's impossible. If the Or Ein Sof is essentially wholeness itself, how can you remove it? It's not a physical substance. You can't reduce it to material terms as something you could take out or put in. So there's a paradox about the reduction that makes the space of creation itself. It can't be reconciled logically. So the answer that the Kabbalists have given us is, oh, it leaves a residue. The residue is neither present nor absent, but utterly transcends positive and negative, giving and withholding. And it's within that residue that the mystery is always present, no matter what seems to appear in a finite world. When we take that scenario to the display of appearances around us, we look at these appearances, and if we are giving the dot of our body-mind over in this act of surrender to try to realize Gnosis, we remind ourselves about that top row, the essence of the ground, its nature, and its capacity to display as a superabundance of open luminosity. If we really understand that, then whatever arises displaces nothing. In other words, when we seem to perceive a thing, we realize that we are wrong. It seems that a thing arises, but we know that there is literally no such thing as a thing. So this understanding of the ground from the top row nullifies the reflection prior to the outset. Before anything even appears, we understand this. In other words, it's not that something appears and, oh, we have to correct the mistake. The mistake was already corrected from the outset, and the very act of appearing is just simply the ground at play. If we hold that view, there are no errors. If we hold that view, seemingly contained and limited things are already nullified. We know that they already have no separate value whatsoever. So that second row, that middle row, portrays the aspects of that understanding. First, from the left-hand side, the first thing that we realize when we see reality already nullified from the outset, the presentation of reality from that point on is pure. So the first aspect is purity, which is nothing other than the basic openness presenting itself. If we understand that all so-called things are essentially open, but are displayed anyway, that display from the basic luminosity of its nature is magic. And the nature of that magic is a purity of vision that is absolutely unmitigated from its original state. In other words, the original openness hasn't budged. And if we understand that all around us in this world of seemingly so-called limited and contained things, there is only openness and its luminosity in a resonant field, in a resonance of fullness that is super abundant. In other words, if we realize that this is Or Ein Sof, our only conclusion is that the phenomena is pure. And this is the basis of what we call pure vision or pure view, the view of reality as pure. The second quality in that middle row is the aspect of spontaneity. In other words, spontaneity asserts that no matter what seems to appear, nothing comes in and nothing leaves. No process diminishes or reduces the fullness of the ground as it seems to. And essentially, whatever seems to appear in time and space is actually beyond time and space. If we understand spontaneity, we're understanding or apprehending purity directly. So the purity manifests itself or expresses itself spontaneously. And through this understanding, which is very difficult for the human mind, we can actually unmake all of the qualities of spatial and temporal and conceptual process thinking that reduce the world to graspable systems of logic. The question is, if we're so habituated to the logic of the body-mind, how do you unmake that habit? Well, you unmake it by recognizing the essential nature of pure spontaneity inherent in things. And it all goes back to those top three qualities. Its essence is open, its nature is divulgent, and its resonance is superabundant. If we understand that, then everything is pure, expressed spontaneously without ever leaving that purity. Hallelujah, right?
Amen.
Right. There's nothing more ecstatic than that realization. The third aspect is the aspect of pervasion. In other words, the spontaneous purity pervades everything. It is wholeness itself. Each of these is the application, or what we could say the utilization, of what precedes it from right, left, and center. The purity is the openness displayed. The spontaneity is the divulgence displayed. And the pervasion is the resonance displayed. But we're always talking about that display prior to the outset of what appears. In other words, no matter what appears, it doesn't change anything. The essence, nature, and display are always the heart of the matter. Now, when we understand how that first row engages in the play of appearance and variation through the second row, the third one is just the logical consequence of that appearing, that the openness, which is understood as pure no matter what appears, is a constant state of opening. Doesn't it make sense that if there is openness, that no matter what appears, it is always opening prior to the reflection of what we think about it? These three at the bottom row are the actional dynamics that go on within appearance. When we look at the glass and we understand that what we think is a finite thing, it's actually essentially open. If we have the capacity to realize even a spark of that openness, this phenomenon becomes pure. In that purity, the action of appearing becomes opening. Its appearance opening itself. And another word for opening is non-reification. Right? It refuses to settle into some limited, contained, lesser mode of interpretation. The openness is opening. In other words, if we understand its purity, reification is not even possible. That's Gnosis. Okay.
Okay.
The second quality of the bottom row is the radiance of the brightness. That's the divulgent nature doing its thing, the surge of open fullness. No matter what appears, the spontaneity of appearance asserts the radiance of the Or Ein Sof. That's pretty easy to understand. If we understand that the Or Ein Sof is the nature of reality, and appearing doesn't diminish or inhibit it, obviously the appearing of anything is just that radiance shining. And that's a wonderful reminder to keep with us in our heart, that no matter what appears, that the radiance of the Or Ein Sof in an actional sense is really the only possible consideration. And this is actually something that confuses people, but is very, very valuable when the horror of the world asserts itself. How do you tell yourself that the atrocities of the world are just the ground at play? How do we tell ourselves that horrible things are the shining of the radiance of Ein Sof? Well, in order to say that and really believe it, you'd have to have a non-dual understanding of the ground beyond good and bad. And you'd have to accept that the kind of joy and bliss of Gnosis that is sought in mysticism is not the bliss or the joy of getting what you want. It's not the bliss and joy of the mind's preferences and pleasures, as opposed to pains. That it has to be the dead dog rotting in the gutter. It has to be the stockyard and the detritus of the slaughterhouse. It has to be the discarded wasteland, as well as the pleasure palace. If it isn't, then we don't understand that the nature and its essence are pervasive and whole. So this is a total shift in view. When I say that Dot surrenders everything to Keter, you got to mean it. Otherwise, we're just talking about the mind realizing what it likes. So the radiance of Or Ein Sof is your grandmother's cancer, but it's also the newborn baby suckling its mother's breast. It's the buds on the trees, and it's the rotting compost of cockroach-infested refuse. So in order to fill out the last row, let's just rehash some of what was said already. We get the first row, the essence, nature, and capacity for display, which is prior to reflection in the foundational sense. This is the water that makes the waves. When the waves arise, we know that they're nullified from the outset. And that aspect of vision is fundamentally pure, spontaneous, and all-pervasive. If we hold that view, the actional dynamics of whatever happens in the ocean is always in a constant state of opening and radiating. And when it's brought to its ultimate peak, which is all the time, always already the case, this sum total of everything I just said becomes awareness itself. Because if you think about awareness outside of any dualistic consideration, without somebody to be aware or something to be aware of, what are we talking about? We're only talking about brightness engaging itself in its own pure spontaneity in an all-pervasive, radiant manner, constantly opening its essential, superabundant nature. When it's reduced to something, knowingness becomes consciousness. And then there's the implication of a conscious identity and the identification of some object. But in and of itself, knowingness is undifferentiated. You can't even attribute it to a person because we can't sense the moment of knowingness outside of knowing some state of how we feel or some thought of what we're thinking about or some quality. Knowingness itself, if it was glimpsed in its pure state, equal to the ground, would be the very definition of gnosis. Gnosis is the understanding of the knife that can't cut itself, the hand that can't clap against itself. It's the understanding of the water of the ocean prior to the consideration of any of its waves. But once the waves arrive, nothing is broken, nothing is mitigated, nothing is compromised. That's pure vision. That's the vision of Keter when it ceases to be a closed door against the ground. And that's the nature of Keter that's realized through the headless head. Remember, the headless head, the head is not a head, but Keter is that which receives the crown. So if what receives the crown of the divine is not even a head, if there's no head there, then what is actually crowned? Well, that's the question. It's an open mystery. In other words, you could say what is crowned is open possibility itself. The head that is crowned is absent. That's the metaphor. It's really very, very sophisticated metaphor. So these three rows of three in the 9 chambers, literally tell us what is realized in gnosis as the dot is accepted. And the Sphirot are literally unmade and remade, or reborn, we could say, in the Gnostic vision. That's all we're going to say for this particular episode of The Long Scroll. But before we go, I would like to make a great announcement, a fantastic announcement of, trumpets please, volume 6 of The Lightning Flash of Aleph, the Black Ether volume that will be going on sale next week. Here it is. It has arrived. And this 6th volume of the Black Ether includes many wonderful new images. Whoops. And I could say, without really having to think about it, that this is by far the weirdest book I ever wrote. Aside from looking at the pictures, I certainly hope people read it because it is out there. And that's coming from me. So unless you have any further questions, Sophia.
I mean, I think this is something I need to reflect on for sure, but I'm ecstatic about Black Ether coming out and I can't wait to take a look at it.
Your slightly stunned quality throughout this session is indicative of what happens when the 9 chambers are really considered by somebody who has studied the system, because your understanding of the system in a mechanical sense is very good. You understand the Sphirot and how they work and the worlds and the aspects of the system that produce functional Kabbalah, right? What is being presented in the 9 chambers isn't functional Kabbalah anymore. It's a study of the Gnostic state. It's a study of the Gnostic state itself. So no Kabbalistic text mentions these things. They're alluded to symbolically, but in order to understand them, you need the presence of the oral tradition, which is what I'm doing right now. But because we have this technology, my dissemination of oral teaching is now available to people. In a sense, recording it means that you're documenting something. Never before in history was the oral tradition documented, because the only way to document things for hundreds of years was to make a book out of them. So here's an oral teaching, introducing something that is truly dumbfounding. So your reaction during this session is very appropriate. You just have to think about it. there's nothing that can really be said. I hope it was clear enough. I did the best job I could, and we will pick it up next time with one last episode of the long scroll. This being the 10th, we will have an 11th here. The 11th implying one beyond the 10, the quasi-sphera of Dot, in a sense, because I want people to understand. So thank you very much for listening, those of you that have, and great rejoicing for the Black Ether this week. It is cause of great celebration. And I bid you all beneficence and superabundance of the ground. Hi-ho.
Hi-ho.